It's absolutely insane, but while my 8-year-old daughter Maya was in the ICU, literally fighting for every breath, my own parents decided we didn't need our room anymore and sold almost all of her belongings to pay for my nephew's wants. When we finally came home from the hospital, they just pointed at the door and told us to leave because we were late with the rent. I didn't cry. I took action. And what happened just 1 month later made them turn pale with shock. We were discharged on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a surreal feeling. Tuesdays are usually for errands, emails, and routine, not for walking out of hospital doors gripping your child's hand while trying to stop your own fingers from shaking. Maya stood by the automatic doors, clutching her tattered stuffed rabbit. She looked better than she had a week ago, but her eyes had that look children get far too early, the realization that adults can smile and say everything will be fine, while attaching tubes and needles to you. "Mom, are we really going home?" she asked so quietly, as if she was afraid I'd change my mind and turn back toward those white corridors and the smell of antiseptic. "Yes, honey. We're going home," I said, trying to keep my voice sounding as normal as possible. Kids always sense fear, and right now my face was the only weather report she had. In the car, she stared out the window and then suddenly turned to me, double-checking. "My bed is still there, right?" I nodded. We had been living in my parents' house, Susan and Robert, for 1.5 years after my divorce. We shared a room, but Maya had her own corner with a bed, a star projector, and a stack of books. I had a narrow cot on the other side and 2 drawers and a dresser, exactly as much space as a temporary person is allowed in someone else's permanent life. When we parked, I unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. She didn't complain. She just sat still and waited for help. I hate that kind of compliance in children. It means they've endured too much pain. In one hand I had my keys. In the other a pharmacy bag and the discharge papers. The front door opened before I could even reach for the lock. My mom was standing there with a smile that looked practiced. My dad hovered behind her, leaning against the doorframe like he was waiting for instructions. My older sister, Ashley, was in the hallway with her son, Mason. For a split second my brain defaulted to its old settings. "They're waiting for us, they've prepared. Everything is going to be okay." Maya gave a shy hi. My mom touched her head gently, as if she were made of thin glass, and told us to come inside because it was cold. Maya immediately headed for the stairs, pinning her rabbit to her ribs. "Can I go to my room now?" she asked. I was about to say of course, but my mother's hand landed on my elbow. It wasn't a grab, more of a polite pause, like someone stopping you from stepping into traffic. "Elena," Mom said, still smiling, "before you go up, do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" I froze. My mind was racing. What did she mean, somewhere to stay? "We live here, Mom," I said flatly. It was just a statement of fact. Mom nodded understandingly. "Yes, and about that. You see, Ashley is using your room right now." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Maya stopped on the stairs, her fingers digging into the rabbit's ear. "You weren't here for 2 weeks," Mom continued smoothly, as if she were explaining to a cashier why a coupon had expired. "The room was empty. Plus, you missed your monthly contribution for the living expenses." I was in the hospital. My daughter was between life and death. My voice started to crack, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I told you I'd pay you later." "We understand," Ashley chimed in, stepping forward. "But we needed the space. Mason needed to practice for his baseball tournament, and his deposit had to be paid by Friday." I felt a chill go through me. I looked at my father, who was intently studying a crack in the ceiling. "Where are our things?" I asked, the question sitting like a lead weight in my stomach. "Most of it is in the garage in boxes," my dad said. "And the rest?" My mom's smile became a bit more strained. "We had to sell a few things. You didn't pay, and we needed the money for Mason's deposit. We sold Maya's game console, her tablet, and those new headphones. They were just sitting there anyway." Maya let out a small sob. Not out of anger but pure shock. She just whispered, "My headphones." I didn't scream. At that moment something inside me finally broke, and then reassembled into a cold, sharp tool. I realized that in this house we were never considered family. We were tenants whose presence was tolerated only as long as it was convenient or profitable. We went to the garage. There, amidst the dust and cold concrete, stood boxes with Maya's things written on them in my mother's perfect calligraphic handwriting. She had labeled them so neatly while she was erasing us from her life. "If you have nowhere else to go, you can crash on the sofa for a night or two," Mom offered, as if she were doing us the greatest favor in the world. "There's no need to make a drama out of this. We're just being flexible." I didn't answer. I looked at my sister, who was already acting like she owned my kitchen, and at my parents, who thought selling a sick child's belongings for another grandchild's baseball trip was a practical decision. I simply helped Maya back into her coat. "Where are you going?" my dad frowned. "It's late." "Away from here," I replied, opening the car door. In the rearview mirror, my parents' house looked exactly as it always had, cozy and safe. No, I knew that behind that facade, there was nothing but cold calculation and betrayal. I didn't know exactly where we were going, but I knew for certain I would never let them dictate the terms of our lives again. This was the first day of our month, and I swear they will regret every single cent they sold us out for. My mother's voice was so calm when she asked if we had a place to sleep, as if she were asking if I'd remembered to buy milk, even though she knew she had just rendered her 8-year-old granddaughter homeless while her surgical scars were still fresh. I drove away from that house with a cold, hollow feeling in my chest, realizing that the people who raised me didn't just lack empathy, they lacked a soul. Maya sat in the passenger seat, staring at the empty space where her tablet used to be, clutching that stuffed rabbit like it was the only anchor she had left in a world that had suddenly capsized. I didn't have a destination, so I just drove, watching the GPS recalibrate over and over again, much like I was trying to recalibrate a life that had been stripped down to a few cardboard boxes in a cold garage. The favoritism in my family had always been a quiet background noise, but now it was a deafening roar that I could no longer ignore. My sister Ashley was always the one who needed support and understanding, while I was the one who was strong and capable, which was really just my parents' way of saying they didn't want to be bothered with my problems. Ashley's son Mason got travel baseball teams and expensive equipment paid for by my parents, while my daughter Maya got easy labels and her things sold off the second we weren't there to guard them. It was a pattern that went back years, starting from the moment my marriage ended and I had to move back home, paying a contribution that was basically market rate rent while Ashley lived her life for free. I realized then that I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a tenant who provided a revenue stream and a source of free labor for their house. As the sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the road, I did the one thing I had been forbidden from doing since I was a teenager. I called my grandmother Helen. My mother had spent years painting Helen as a difficult and unstable woman who couldn't be trusted, but as I sat in that car with my daughter's quiet breathing next to me, I realized that my mother's version of the truth was usually just a weapon she used to isolate people she couldn't control. I remembered Helen as the only person who ever looked me in the eyes and told me my feelings mattered, before she was suddenly erased from our lives like a smudge on a window. When she picked up the phone, her voice wasn't the voice of a monster. It was steady, old, and incredibly weary, yet it had a warmth that I hadn't felt in my parents' house for a single second. I didn't even have to give her the full story before she told me to come over, her address being a small apartment about an hour away in a town that my mother always spoke of with such disdain. The drive was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with all the things you're not saying to your child because you don't want to break the last bit of magic they have left. When we arrived, Helen was already standing at the door, looking older than the memories I had of her, but with the same sharp, observant eyes that seemed to see right through the fake smiles my mother had taught me to wear. She didn't ask for explanations or apologies for the years of silence. She just opened the door wide and let us into a space that smelled of old wood, tea, and something that felt remarkably like safety. Maya immediately curled up on the small sofa under a knitted blanket that Helen provided without a word. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I saw my daughter's shoulders drop from around her ears. Later that night, after Maya had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, Helen sat across from me at her small kitchen table, pushing a mug of tea toward me with hands that were gnarled but steady. She told me the real reason she had been cut off. She had stopped being useful to my mother after she hurt her back and couldn't help with the cleaning and the errands anymore. My mother didn't want a mother. She wanted a servant, and when the service stopped, so did the relationship. It was a mirror image of what had just happened to me, and the realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Then Helen stood up and went to her bedroom, returning with a worn, dusty cardboard box that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. She set it on the table between us and told me that she didn't have much cash, not enough to solve my life or buy us a house. No, she had this box of old papers and certificates my grandfather had left behind. She said she never knew what to do with them and that my mother had always tried to get her hands on the box, which was why Helen had hidden it so well before she was kicked out. I looked at the box, feeling a strange mix of hope and dread, wondering if there was anything in there that could actually help us, or if it was just another piece of a family history that was better left forgotten. I reached out to open the lid, my heart hammering against my ribs, knowing that whatever was inside was the only thing standing between us and a life of crawling back to the people who had sold my daughter's soul for a baseball deposit. I spent 3 hours Googling dead companies only to find a piece of paper that turned my parents' betrayal into the biggest mistake of their lives. And I realized that the people who had treated me like a burden were about to find out exactly how much that burden was actually worth. I sat at Helen's small laminate kitchen table while the blue light of my phone screen burned into my tired eyes, and I went through every single certificate in that dusty box, feeling a wave of disappointment with every name that led to a defunct corporation or a bankrupt retail chain from the 90s. Helen sat across from me, her hands folded over her apron, watching me with a silent, expectant intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy and charged with a desperate kind of hope that I was terrified of crushing. I found old papers for companies that no longer existed, stocks that were worth less than the paper they were printed on, and for a moment, I thought this was just another cruel joke played by a family history that specialized in disappointment. Then I pulled out a faded, crisp certificate that said Apple Computer Incorporated on the top in a font that looked like it belonged in a museum, and I felt a strange electric jolt go through my fingers as I saw the date and the amount of $400 written in my grandfather's neat, careful handwriting. I didn't think much of it at first because $400 wouldn't even cover a month's worth of groceries in this economy, but then I started looking up the history of the stock splits, and my breath hitched in my throat as the numbers began to multiply on my screen like some kind of glitch in reality. I checked the math 3 times, then a fourth, my pulse thudding in my ears so loudly that I could barely hear the hum of the refrigerator, as I realized that those few original shares had split and doubled and quadrupled over decades, until they had turned into over 4,000 shares of one of the most valuable companies on the planet. I stared at the final number on the calculator, $1,900,000, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me because this was the kind of money that didn't just change lives, it erased every single problem my parents had ever used to hold me under their thumb. The silence of the apartment was shattered by the sharp, intrusive ring of my phone, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw my mother's name flashing on the screen, her timing so predatory that it felt as if she had been watching me through the window. I answered because I knew that if I didn't, she would just keep calling until she woke up Maya. And the second I pressed the phone to my ear, I heard that sharp, jagged edge in her voice that she only used when she was trying to intimidate me into submission. She didn't ask if we were safe or where we were staying. She immediately demanded to know why I had taken the box from the garage and accused me of stealing family property that didn't belong to me. She told me that she had gone into the garage to organize the rest of our things, which I knew was a lie for looking for anything else she could sell, and she realized the cardboard box Helen had hidden was missing. Her voice was rising in pitch as she told me that Helen was senile and didn't have the right to give away anything, and that if I didn't bring the box back to her house by tomorrow morning, she would call the police and report me for elder abuse and theft. I listened to her rave about how I was being ungrateful, and how the family needed those papers to ensure Mason's future, and I realized that she had probably known about the potential value of that box for years, but had never been able to find where Helen had tucked it away. I felt a cold, hard anger settle in my chest as I reminded her that she had sold my daughter's belongings to pay for a baseball deposit, and she had the audacity to scream back that Mason was her real grandson, and that I was lucky they had even let me live in their house for as long as they did. She told me that I was nothing without their help, and that I would be back on their doorstep begging for a place on the sofa within a week, because I was too weak to survive on my own. I didn't tell her about the Apple stock. I just stayed silent while she spewed her venom, realizing that every word she said was just another reason why I would never, ever let her see a single cent of that money. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me after threatening to come to Helen's apartment herself to settle things. And I knew that the next few days were going to be a war of nerves that I wasn't sure I was prepared to fight. I looked at Helen, who had heard enough of the shouting to know exactly what was happening, and she just reached out and squeezed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. She told me that she had already contacted a lawyer friend years ago but was too afraid to follow through, and that we needed to move fast before my mother and Ashley could coordinate their next move. I spent the rest of the night staring at the door, half expecting my father to burst through it with a set of keys or a police officer to show up at my mother's command, the tension in the room so thick that I could practically taste the copper tang of fear on my tongue. Every creak in the hallway and every distant siren made me jump, and I realized that my parents weren't just going to let us walk away with our lives. They were going to try to burn everything down just to keep us from being free. I looked at Maya sleeping peacefully on the couch, oblivious to the fact that her grandparents were currently plotting to ruin her mother's life, and I felt a fierce protective rage that drowned out the fear, knowing that the real conflict was only just beginning. My parents didn't just sell my daughter's toys to pay for a baseball game. They were planning to use my grandmother's supposed dementia as a legal loophole to seize every penny of an inheritance that was meant to keep my child safe. The morning after I found the apple stock, the air in the apartment felt different. It was thick with the realization that I was holding a piece of paper worth nearly $2 million while sitting in a kitchen where the faucet leaked and the floorboards creaked. I didn't feel like a millionaire, I felt like a target. I spent the first few hours of the day calling every high-end estate lawyer in the city, until I found one who didn't sound like she was reading from a script. Her name was Sarah, and she told me to bring the box and my grandmother to her office immediately, her voice carrying a level of urgency that made my stomach do somersaults. As I helped Helen into the car, I saw a familiar silver SUV idling at the end of the block, my mother's car. She wasn't even hiding anymore. She was watching us, waiting for a moment to swoop in and reclaim what she thought was hers by divine right of being the head of the family. In Sarah's office, the atmosphere was sterile and quiet, the kind of place where people come to decide who gets what after someone dies. Sarah went through the papers with a magnifying glass and a focused silence that lasted for 20 agonizing minutes while Maya played with a fidget spinner in the corner, oblivious to the fact that her entire future was being weighed on a scale. When Sarah finally looked up, she didn't smile. She told me that the stock was 100% legitimate, and that the transfer of the physical certificates to a digital brokerage account was a straightforward process. But there was a massive complication that I hadn't seen coming. My parents hadn't just been making empty threats on the phone. They had filed for an emergency temporary guardianship over Helen at the county courthouse at 8 o'clock that morning. They were claiming that Helen was suffering from advanced cognitive decline, and that I had kidnapped her and coerced her into giving me her financial assets. Sarah looked me straight in the eyes and said that if a judge signed that order, my parents would have total control over Helen's person and her property, including the box of stocks, and I could be facing felony charges for exploitation of the elderly. I felt the blood drain from my face as the room started to spin. My own parents were willing to label their mother as mentally incompetent just to get their hands on a windfall they didn't earn. But then the phone rang. It was a text from my sister Ashley. It said, "Meet me at the diner on 4th Street in 10 minutes. Alone. I have something you need to hear before the hearing tomorrow." I told Sarah to keep Helen and Maya in her office and lock the door, and I ran to that diner with my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. Ashley was sitting in a back booth, looking haggard and older than I'd ever seen her, her hands shaking as she gripped a coffee mug. She didn't apologize for taking our room or for selling Maya's things. She just leaned across the table and whispered that the house, the family home I had lived in for years, was in active foreclosure. My parents had stopped paying the mortgage 6 months ago because my father had lost his pension in a bad investment scheme they had kept secret from everyone. They weren't just being greedy. They were weeks away from being out on the street themselves, and they had moved Ashley and Mason in because they needed her paycheck to keep the lights on. Then came the twist that made my skin crawl. Ashley told me that our mother had known about the Apple stock for years. She had found a copy of the list of assets in my grandfather's old desk, but couldn't find the actual certificates because Helen had moved them. My mother had been waiting for Helen to slip up or pass away so she could claim them, and she only kicked me and Maya out because she thought that by making us desperate, she could force Helen to reveal the location of the box to save us. The plan backfired when I went to Helen directly, and now my mother was in a blind rage, ready to commit perjury in court to say she saw me stealing the box from Helen's nightstand while Helen was confused and crying. Ashley looked at me with a mixture of fear and envy and said, If you give me $300,000, I'll testify against Mom. I'll tell the judge that Helen is perfectly sane and that Mom planned the whole thing. If you don't, I'm going to stand by her and you're going to jail." I sat there looking at my sister, realizing that my entire family was a nest of vipers who saw each other as nothing more than bargaining chips. The moral dilemma was suffocating. I could pay my sister off to secure my freedom and Helen's safety, essentially rewarding her for her betrayal, or I could refuse to be extorted and risk losing everything, my daughter, my grandmother, and my future, in a court system that might actually believe my mother's practiced lies. I had less than 24 hours to decide if I was going to become exactly like them to beat them at their own game. I walked out of that diner without giving her an answer, the weight of the decision pressing down on me so hard I could barely breathe. I had the money to save everyone, but the cost of that salvation was my own soul, and as I drove back to the lawyer's office, I realized that the family I thought I knew had never actually existed at all. My parents sat in the front row of the courtroom wearing their best concerned faces, completely unaware that the woman they were trying to declare mentally incompetent had spent the last 48 hours recording every single one of their threatening phone calls on a voice memo app I'd taught her how to use. I didn't pay my sister Ashley the $300,000 she demanded because I realized that giving in to her extortion would just mean I was buying a temporary seat at a table full of thieves. And I wasn't going to let my daughter Maya grow up thinking that's how you handle people who are supposed to love you. The morning of the hearing was cold and gray, the kind of day that makes everything feel like it's being viewed through a filter of charcoal. And as I walked into that courtroom with Helen and our lawyer, I could feel the weight of my mother's gaze burning into the back of my neck like a physical brand. My mother, Susan, actually managed to squeeze out a few crocodile tears when she took the stand, telling the judge about how confused her poor mother had become and how I had preyed on a vulnerable elderly woman to steal a box of family heirlooms. She looked the judge right in the eye and lied under oath, saying she had seen me physically shaking Helen to get her to sign over the stock certificates, and for a second, the room went so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. But then it was our turn. Sarah, our lawyer, didn't start with the money or the stocks. She started by playing a recording from the night before, where my father Robert's voice came through the speakers loud and clear, telling me that if I didn't split the loot, they would make sure I never saw Maya again. Then she played a clip of my mother telling Helen that they would put her in the cheapest state-run nursing home they could find if she didn't testify that I had stolen the box. The look on my mother's face when she heard her own voice echoed back at her was something I will never forget. It wasn't shame, it was pure, unadulterated fury that she had been caught. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to one of visible disgust, and when Helen herself stood up to speak, she did so with a clarity and a dignity that made my parents look like the petty children they actually were. She explained exactly why she had hidden the certificates and why she wanted me to have them, detailing years of financial and emotional neglect she had suffered at the hands of her own daughter. The guardianship petition was dismissed within 20 minutes. And the judge even went as far as to suggest that the district attorney look into the evidence of attempted fraud and witness intimidation my parents had displayed. We walked out of that courthouse and into a life that was finally, for the first time, entirely our own, but the victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a funeral for a family that never really existed. I used a portion of the stock to buy a modest, sturdy house in a quiet neighborhood with a big backyard where Maya could finally have the dog she'd been asking for, and a room that no one could ever take away from her. Helen moved in with us, occupying a sun-drenched suite on the first floor where she spends her mornings gardening, and her afternoons teaching Maya how to bake the cookies I remember from my childhood. I also filed a civil suit against my parents and Ashley for the value of the items they sold while we were in the hospital, and a month later, a check arrived in the mail for the exact amount they had made from selling Maya's things. I didn't spend it. I put it into a high-yield savings account for Maya's college fund, a constant reminder that the things they tried to destroy eventually became the foundation for something better. The silence from my parents' side has been absolute since the day of the hearing, and while a part of me expected a grand confrontation or a desperate apology, the reality is much more hollow and quiet. They lost their house to foreclosure just as Ashley had predicted, and from what I've heard through distant relatives, they're now living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city, still blaming me for every single one of their failures. I sometimes wonder if they ever sit in their small living room and regret the moment they decided a baseball deposit was worth more than their granddaughter's stability, or if people like that are even capable of that kind of self-reflection. Money didn't fix the trauma of being betrayed by the people who were supposed to be my safety net, but it gave me the one thing they always tried to deny me: the power to say no, and the resources to walk away. I stand in my kitchen now, watching the sun set over the fence, listening to the muffled sounds of Maya and Helen laughing in the next room, and I realize that the most expensive thing in that house isn't the stock or the new furniture. It's the peace of knowing that no one is coming to take our beds, no one is selling our memories, and the only contribution I have to make now is to the happiness of the two people who actually stayed when things got dark. I used to think family was a debt you could never finish paying, a series of obligations and sacrifices that only went one way. But I've learned that real family is the group of people who don't ask you what you're worth before they decide to help you. So what do you think? Did I do the right thing by cutting them off completely and taking the money? Or did I just become another version of the people I was trying to escape?